The pen was already in my hand when her lawyer smiled at me from across the table. It was the kind of smile you give someone you've already beaten. She didn't even glance at the documents. Neither did my wife. I signed. Every page, every line. 31 years, reduced to ink on paper, and I signed all of it without hesitation. My own attorney put his hand on my arm and said, quietly, "Walter, I need you to stop." I told him I was fine. He said I wasn't thinking clearly. I told him I had never been clearer in my life. My wife was looking at her nails. Her lawyer was already texting someone on her phone. I signed the last page, capped the pen, and slid the folder back across the table. That was a Tuesday morning in October. By Friday afternoon, her lawyer was on the phone with mine, and the tone had changed completely. But I should start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what the last 4 years of my marriage actually looked like. I built my first deck with my father when I was 14 years old, a back deck for the Hendersons on Maple Creek Road in Clarksville, Tennessee. Pressure-treated lumber, nothing fancy, but my father made me measure every board twice, cut once, and sand every edge until it was smooth enough that you could run your palm across it without flinching. He said a man's work is a reflection of his character. I never forgot that. By the time I was 30, I had my own contracting business. Small at first, residential renovations, additions, the occasional custom build. My wife and I had just gotten married the year before. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever stood next to, and I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. I was not a perfect husband. I worked too much. I missed dinners. I missed school plays. I was at a job site on the morning of our 25th anniversary because a client had a water intrusion emergency and I felt obligated. She reminded me of that for the next 6 years. Our son was born in 1997. I will not use his name here, but I will tell you that he has my father's hands, wide palms, square knuckles, and my mother's patience. He is the best thing I have ever had any part in. He was 24 years old when the divorce started, out of college, working at an architecture firm in Nashville, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be hurt by it without showing it. The contracting business had grown. By 2018, we had 32 employees, a full design-build division, and a reputation in Middle Tennessee that had taken me 27 years to build. My wife handled the books for the first 15 years. She knew the business inside and out. She knew what it was worth. That matters. The first time I noticed something was wrong was not when she started coming home late. It was earlier than that. It was the way she stopped asking about the jobs. For years, every evening, she would ask what I was working on, who the clients were, how the crew was doing. It was ritual. Then one spring, the questions just stopped. I told myself she was tired. I told myself we had been married long enough that silence was comfortable. I was wrong. Silence was not comfortable. Silence was the sound of someone who had already moved on and was just waiting for the right moment to say so. I found out about the other man in the way that I imagine most people find out, not from a confession, not from a confrontation, but from something small and accidental. A phone left on the kitchen counter. A name I didn't recognize appearing 4, 5, 6 times in an hour. I am not proud of what I did next, but I picked up that phone, and I read what was there, and I stood in my own kitchen for a long time without moving. The man was someone I had met twice at a home and garden expo in Nashville. She had come with me to that expo. I had introduced them. I did not say anything that night. I made dinner. I sat across from her at the table we had bought at an estate sale in 1996, and I watched her eat, and I tried to find something in her face that explained it. There was nothing. She talked about a neighbor's dog and a recipe she wanted to try. I nodded and said, and washed the dishes afterward. That was in March. I spent the next 6 months being very quiet and very deliberate. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive man by nature. My father was not vindictive. My grandfather was not vindictive. The men I come from believed in doing honest work, keeping your word, and letting God sort out the rest. I did not want to hurt my wife. I did not want to destroy her. What I wanted, more than anything, was to protect what I had spent a lifetime building. Not the business, not the house, not the money. My son, his future. That was the only thing I was fighting for. I called an attorney in April. Not a divorce attorney, an estate planning attorney. a man named Gerald who had done some work for me years before when I was setting up the business structure. I told him what I knew and what I was afraid of, and I asked him what my options were. He listened for a long time. Then he asked me a question I had not expected. He asked me when I had last updated the trust. I had set up a family trust back in 2009 after a contractor friend of mine went through a brutal divorce and lost everything, business included, because it had all been marital property with no separation. Gerald had helped me restructure things at the time, putting the business into a limited liability structure with my son named as the successor beneficiary. Life insurance. Buy-sell provisions. The kind of paperwork that sits in a drawer for years and you hope you never need. Gerald said, "The trust hasn't been touched in 15 years. Some of it needs updating, and if you want to do this correctly, we should move now, before anything is filed." I said, "Tell me what to do." Over the next 5 months, Gerald and I worked quietly. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise flags. We updated the trust documents. We restructured the business ownership so that the operating entity was cleanly separated from any personal marital assets. The equity in the business, the real value, the goodwill, the client relationships, the equipment, all of it sat inside the trust, with my son as the primary beneficiary. What remained in my personal name was what Gerald called the visible layer. The house, one personal savings account, the truck, a small investment account my wife knew about. We also did something else. Something that took 2 meetings and a lot of uncomfortable paperwork. The house we had lived in for 22 years. The house she loved, the house she had remodeled twice and repainted 4 times and planted every rose bush in the front yard of, had a second mortgage on it. Had for 3 years. A home equity line of credit I had used to purchase equipment for the business. The balance was not small. Gerald told me I was not required to volunteer that information. He said it was in the public record. He said any competent attorney reviewing the asset disclosure would find it immediately. I said, "What if they don't look?" He looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "Then that's on them." She filed in September. I was not surprised. I had been expecting it. What I had not expected was the particular cruelty of the language she used, not in the filing itself, but in the conversation she had with our son before she told me. She called him on a Sunday evening and told him that I had been emotionally absent for years, that the marriage had been hollow, that she deserved to be happy. She did not mention the man from the expo. Our son called me an hour later and said, very carefully, "Dad, are you okay?" I said I was fine. He said, "I know about the divorce filing. Mom called me." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you, Dad." I had to put the phone down for a minute after that. Her attorney was a woman named Diane, sharp, confident, mid-50s, the kind of lawyer who walks into a room and immediately starts measuring the square footage. She had a reputation in Nashville for aggressive asset division cases. My wife had chosen her specifically, I later found out, because Diane had won a case 2 years prior where the wife was awarded 63% of a family-owned business. My wife had done her homework. What Diane did not do was read the financial disclosure carefully. My own attorney, a quiet, thorough man named Paul, who had been practicing family law for 30 years, walked me through every line of the disclosure before we submitted it. Everything was accurate. Everything was disclosed. The second mortgage on the house was listed on page 4, line 17. The business trust structure was disclosed. In the attached exhibits, the investment account my wife knew about was there. The small savings account was there. Paul said to me, "Walter, I have to advise you that you are giving up significantly more than you are likely required to under Tennessee law. The court would probably award you." I said, "I know what I'm doing." He said, "I don't think you do." I said, "Paul, I've been measuring twice and cutting once my whole life. Trust me." He did not look convinced. The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday. Her attorney arrived 15 minutes late, which I later found out was intentional, a psychological tactic, making the other party sit and stew. My wife arrived with her, wearing a blazer I had never seen before. She looked good. I want to say that she looked tired or nervous or guilty, but none of those things were true. She looked like someone about to close a deal she had been working toward for a long time. Diane opened by presenting their position: the house, the primary savings account, the investment account, 50% of the business valuation, which, Based on a quick appraisal they had commissioned, she valued it approximately $840,000. She said my wife had contributed to the business for the first 15 years and was entitled to an equitable share. She said the marriage had irretrievably broken down due to my emotional unavailability and failure to prioritize the relationship. She did not mention the man from the expo. Paul started to respond. I put my hand on his arm and said, I'd like to speak. Diane looked at me the way lawyers look at clients who don't know what they're doing. I said, I'm not going to contest the house. I'm not going to contest the savings account. I'm not going to contest the investment account. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign today. The room was quiet. Paul said, under his breath, Walter. My wife looked up from her phone for the first time since she'd sat down. I said, I want this done. I don't want to fight. She can have what's in my name. All of it. Diane leaned over to my wife and said something quietly. My wife nodded and said, That's acceptable. Diane pulled out the settlement agreement, which she had clearly already prepared before the mediation, because it took her about 12 seconds, and slid it across the table. Paul went pale. He said, I need 10 minutes with my client. I said, I don't need 10 minutes. I picked up the pen. I read every page not because I was looking for an escape, but because I wanted to make sure every number was exactly what it was supposed to be. The house, the savings account, the investment account, all of it in her name. No alimony claims on either side. No dispute over personal property. There was one line about the business. It read, Respondent retains any interest held in personal name in Walter D. Construction, LLC. My interest in the operating LLC, held in my personal name, was a nominal 2%. The remaining 98% was held in trust, with my son as beneficiary. Diane had used the appraisal to value the whole enterprise, but the settlement agreement, the document she had drafted, only transferred my personal ownership stake. I looked at that line for a moment. Then I signed. Paul did not speak to me in the elevator on the way down. He waited until we were in the parking garage, and then he turned to me and said, You just signed away the house and both accounts. Do you understand what you gave up? I said, Yes. He said, The house has a... I said, I know, Paul. He stared at me. Then something shifted in his expression. He said slowly, You knew she wasn't going to read the disclosure. I said, I didn't know. I suspected. He stood there for a moment. Then he shook his head and said, I've been practicing law for 30 years, Walter. He paused. I've never watched someone do what you just did. I got in my truck and drove to the job site I had scheduled for that afternoon. There was a deck to finish in Brentwood, and my crew was waiting. It took 72 hours. Paul called me on Friday morning. I was eating breakfast, eggs, and toast, the same thing I have eaten every morning for 40 years. He said, I just got off the phone with Diane. I said, And? He said, She's not happy. What had happened, Paul explained, was this. Diane had filed the settlement agreement with the court and begun the transfer process for the house. Her title company had run a standard title search, the kind that any competent real estate attorney runs before transferring property. The title search had found the home equity line of credit, the outstanding balance, the lien on the property. My wife had agreed to take the house. The house had $214,000 in debt attached to it. The savings account she received was real and unencumbered. It contained $47,000. The investment account contained $31,000, money that had been there for years and had not grown significantly because I had not added to it. The business Diane had valued at $840,000 using a cursory appraisal was an LLC that I personally owned 2% of. The trust owned 98%. The trust was my son's. I had transferred nothing of the operating business. I had only transferred my nominal personal stake, worth approximately $16,000 on a good day. Paul said, Diane is claiming you concealed assets. I said, Were the trust documents in the disclosure? Pause. Exhibit C, he said, pages 31 through 47. Was the second mortgage on the house in the disclosure? Page 4, line 17. Did Diane review the disclosure before drafting the settlement agreement? Longer pause. That's what I asked her, Paul said. She said her client had assured her everything was straightforward and that she had reviewed the primary assets. I finished my eggs. Paul said, "Walter, she's going to try to reopen the settlement." I said, "On what grounds?" "She'll argue fraud, concealment, material misrepresentation." I said, "Can she?" Pause. "No," he said. "I don't believe she can. Everything was disclosed. Every document. Every line. She signed a settlement agreement that her client agreed to. She had full access to the disclosure for 3 weeks before mediation." He exhaled. "Diane is an experienced attorney. She made an assumption. She's not going to admit that to anyone, but that's what happened." I said, "What does my wife have right now?" He said, "A house with more debt than she can likely service on her income, a combined $78,000 in liquid assets, and a lawsuit threat that has no basis." I said, "And my son? The trust is intact. The business continues operating under the trust structure. Your son remains the successor beneficiary. None of it was touched." I put down my coffee cup and looked out the window at the backyard. There was a bird feeder I had built out of scrap cedar 2 summers ago. A pair of chickadees were working through the seeds. I said, "Thank you, Paul." He said, "Walter, one more thing." "Yes?" "She called me 3 times this morning." Brief pause. The third call. She was crying. I did not say anything to that. I want to be clear about how I feel, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant on that Friday morning. I did not feel like I had won something. What I felt was close to what you feel when a storm finally passes and you walk outside and the air is completely still and the damage is done and you are just glad to still be standing. That kind of quiet, that kind of tired. I had not wanted to destroy my wife. I had not engineered any of this to punish her. What I had done every step of it, from the call to Gerald in April to the signature in the mediation room, was build a wall around my son's future. That was all. The rest of it, the house and the debt and the untenable situation she now found herself in, was the consequence of a very smart lawyer who had made a very expensive assumption. My son came up from Nashville that Saturday. He drove 3 hours on a rainy October afternoon, showed up at my door with a bag of groceries, and made dinner while I sat at the kitchen table and watched him move around the space the way he had moved around it since he was 8 years old. He knew where everything was. He didn't need to be told. After dinner, we sat on the back porch. The rain had stopped. He asked me how I was doing, really, not politely. I told him I was okay, which was the truth, mostly. He asked if I felt bad about how things had turned out for his mother. I thought about that for a while. I said, "I feel bad that it got to this point. I don't feel bad about protecting you." He nodded slowly. He said, "She called me. She's angry." I said, "I know. She says you tricked her." I said, "Every number was in the disclosure. Every document was attached. I didn't hide anything. I just didn't explain it to her." He was quiet. Then he said, "Is there a difference?" I said, "In a court of law, yes. In a marriage, I don't know. Maybe not. I'm not proud of every part of this." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "You built something for me. For 30 years, you built something. She was going to take it." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know, Dad." We sat out there until the temperature dropped and the chickadees went wherever chickadees go at night. And then we went inside and watched a football game, and he fell asleep on the couch around halftime the way he used to when he was a kid, and I let him sleep there, and I turned off most of the lights and sat in the armchair that had belonged to my father, and I thought about what it means to build something that lasts. A few practical things happened over the following months that I think are worth knowing. The attempt to reopen the settlement went nowhere. Paul responded to Diane's letter in 3 paragraphs, citing the specific page and line numbers of every disclosure document she had failed to read. He did not editorialize. He did not threaten. He simply listed the facts, in order, and closed by noting that his client had signed a voluntary settlement agreement in the presence of both attorneys, and that there was no legal mechanism available to void it on the basis of an oversight by opposing counsel. Diane did not respond to that letter. The house went back to the bank 6 months later. My wife could not service the debt. I am not glad about that. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this into a story about punishment, and that's not what it is. The house going back to the bank was not a victory for me. It was just what happened when a person made a very large decision without reading the paperwork. The business continued. We brought in 2 new commercial clients in the spring. My son came up twice to walk some of the larger job sites. He has an eye for structure. That kid comes from both sides, honestly, and on one of those visits he told me he had been thinking about the future, about what he wanted to build, about the trust. I said, "It'll be there when you're ready," he said. "It's already there." I said, "Yeah, it is." People ask me sometimes, not many people, just a few who know the full story, whether I feel like I got justice. I always think about that word for a moment before I answer. Justice feels like the wrong frame. Justice implies that someone needed to be punished, that the scales needed to be balanced, that some cosmic ledger needed to be corrected. I don't think about it that way. What I think about is this. I was a 14-year-old kid standing on a platform I helped build, sanding the edges of a board until they were smooth enough not to hurt anyone. My father standing next to me, not saying much, just working. The smell of sawdust and pine resin. The particular satisfaction of a surface that is exactly what it's supposed to be. I have spent my whole life trying to build things that last. I built a deck, then a business, then a family. Then when the family started to come apart, a structure that would hold my son's future in place regardless of what happened around it. None of that was about revenge. All of it was about the same thing it has always been about. You measure twice. You cut once. You sand the edges until they can't hurt anybody. And when you're done, what you built is still standing. That's enough for me. That has always been enough. Where are you watching from tonight? Whatever you've been through, whatever you're carrying, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments, and if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, you know what to do.